In the shadowed aftermath of the First World War, a man emerged from the chaos of a broken empire, his gaze fixed with unnerving clarity on Germany's future. Adolf Hitler, once a drifting soldier and failed artist, began to mold his identity around a singular purpose, reviving a humiliated nation and shaping it according to his vision. From the dim beer halls of Munich to the fervent rallies that would later define his movement, Hitler drew men to him not through kindness or camaraderie, but through fervor, promise, and, most crucially, control. In those early years, trust, if it could be called that, was not given but crafted like a weapon. Ernst Röhm was one of the first to stand close to Hitler's fire. A hardened veteran with a volatile temperament, Röhm saw in Hitler the embodiment of nationalist revival and offered him the muscle to seize it. Together, they built the Sturmabteilung, the SA, a street-fighting force that blended loyalty with brutality. Röhm, who knew Hitler when he was still just a man with a pamphlet and a dream, believed himself indispensable. That belief would prove fatal. Others came, drawn not only by ideology but by opportunity. Rudolf Hess, awkward and fiercely devoted, latched on to Hitler with near-spiritual reverence, eventually becoming his private secretary and closest legal proxy. There was something pitiful yet essential in Hess's loyalty, a blind submission that made him valuable in a hierarchy where obedience was prized above all else. If Rome provided the fists, Hess provided the ink, standing always just behind his Führer, silent and ready. Even then, before the ascent to national power, Hitler began shaping the circle around him not as equals but as orbiting bodies, each dependent on the gravity of his ambition. Those who could not be molded were discarded, those who could, drawn in closer. This instinct to command through personal dominance, not institutional framework, would become the hallmark of his rule. The failed beer hall putsch in 1923, which might have ended Hitler's movement in its infancy, instead sharpened his sense of who could be trusted. Imprisoned for treason, he used his time not to reflect, but to plan. In the stone-walled silence of Landsberg prison, he dictated Mein Kampf to Hess, transforming his rage into ideology and his followers into believers. Those who remained loyal after the failure, those who clung to him when his name was scorned, became the core around which he would rebuild. This was where trust, for Hitler, became less about belief and more about utility under pressure. By the time the Nazi Party clawed its way to national power in 1933, the outlines of Hitler's inner circle had begun to take shape. Yet even as chancellorship crowned his political resurrection, Hitler saw danger not from his enemies, but from those closest to him. He began to measure loyalty in silence, in submission, in usefulness. He had no desire for friends, only functionaries who understood their place in the architecture of his will. Röhm, once indispensable, had begun to forget the balance. As head of the SA, he commanded millions of men, more than the German army itself. He spoke brashly of revolution continuing, of completing the purge of the old elite. Hitler, now allied with industrialists and military brass, saw a threat, not a comrade. Trust, once given, was now revoked. In the summer of 1934, under the veil of national stability, Hitler struck. The Night of the Long Knives, as it came to be called, was not just an execution of Röhm and his SA leadership. It was a message, carved in blood, that trust could not be assumed, and that proximity to the Führer offered no sanctuary from betrayal. Out of the shadows of that purge rose others. Heinrich Himmler, calculating and cold, had provided the SS to execute Hitler's will. His reward was elevation, his loyalty proven through action rather than sentiment. Hermann Göring, once a decorated pilot, now reveled in his role as a political operator, whispering poison into Hitler's ear to ensure rivals were eliminated. These men understood the language of Hitler's trust: compete with each other, but never with him. It was Martin Bormann, quiet and watchful, who perhaps grasped it best. He did not seek power through charm or ideology, but by managing Hitler's life with obsessive precision. He filtered access, buried dissenting voices, and curated loyalty as if it were paperwork. Others shouted. Bormann listened. And Hitler, increasingly isolated and suspicious, came to rely on that silence. The central conflict was no longer ideological. It was personal. Hitler trusted those who understood that to serve him was to sacrifice autonomy. The closer one stood, the more absolute that surrender had to be. And as the nation slipped into war, as Hitler's vision widened from continental dominance to apocalyptic conquest, the question of trust became not just personal, but existential. Could anyone be loyal enough, useful enough to remain within the narrowing circle of favor? For now, the structure held. The men around him watched one another like predators in a shrinking cage, aware that devotion alone was not enough. It had to be demonstrated, constantly, fatally, if necessary. And at the center, Hitler observed them all, the architect of a regime built on obedience, fear, and a trust that could shatter at the slightest hint of doubt. By the time war unfurled across Europe, Hitler's inner circle had transformed into a shifting theater of ambition and allegiance. The men who surrounded him were not merely subordinates. They were actors in a carefully orchestrated performance, each striving to interpret the Führer's will with the most fervor, each desperately hoping that proximity equaled permanence. Yet none were safe, for Hitler's trust was transactional, fragile, and subject to sudden, ruthless recalibration. Heinrich Himmler had risen through silence and cold precision. Soft-spoken, almost pedantic in demeanor, he presented a startling contrast to the violence he unleashed. As Reichsführer of the SS, he constructed a kingdom of terror, cloaked in bureaucracy and ritual. Where others sought Hitler's approval with flattery or bravado, Himmler offered results, deadly efficiency and ideological purity. Hitler admired his devotion to the racial mission, the systemic application of cruelty that gave form to the most monstrous parts of Nazi doctrine. Yet even Himmler's position, vast as it became, was never entirely secure. He was useful, yes, but he was also watched. Then there was Joseph Goebbels, the master of words and spectacle. Small in stature but volcanic in passion, Goebbels wielded propaganda like a weapon of war. He made Hitler into more than a man. He crafted him into myth. Through radio broadcasts, mass rallies, and cinema, Goebbels conjured a vision of a reborn Germany with Hitler at its core. His devotion bordered on worship. He once described his loyalty as fanatical, and he proved it to the end. Where others might have fled, Goebbels stayed, choosing to die at Hitler's side rather than live in a world without him. But even he was not immune to suspicion. At moments, his ambition caused discomfort. Hitler kept him close, but never allowed him to stray beyond the bounds of his role. Hermann Göring, once the heir apparent, operated with a different energy altogether. Lavish, boastful, and opulent in his tastes, Göring was a creature of contradiction, both cunning and careless, both powerful and deeply insecure. Hitler trusted him in the early years, relying on his political skill and his control over the Luftwaffe to maintain balance within the Reich. Göring exuded confidence, calling himself Hitler's designated successor. But as the war turned, so too did Hitler's faith. The Luftwaffe faltered, Göring grew bloated with privilege, and rumors of disloyalty echoed louder. By 1945, his name was spoken with bitterness, his legacy tarnished not only by failure, but by the perception that he had presumed too much. In a final act of political miscalculation, Göring sent a telegram suggesting he take control as Hitler lay trapped in Berlin. The response was swift, orders for his arrest, and a final severance of trust. Rudolf Hess was the ghost of earlier days, a symbol of purer if misguided loyalty. He had been there from the beginning, helping transcribe Mein Kampf, standing silently in Hitler's shadow through the party's ascent. But Hess's devotion was not matched by political skill. He was awkward, ill-suited for court intrigue, and increasingly sidelined. In 1941, in a move that baffled even his closest peers, Hess flew solo to Scotland in a naive bid to negotiate peace with Britain. Hitler was humiliated. The gesture was not interpreted as loyalty, but as delusion, even betrayal. Hess became a pariah, imprisoned for the remainder of the war, his name rarely uttered except in contempt. His fall revealed the dangerous thinness of the line between loyalty and madness. And then, in the growing shadows of Hitler's world, moved Martin Bormann. Unlike the others, Bormann had no public face. He did not court admiration, nor seek speeches or uniforms. He gained power through control of access. As Hitler's private secretary, he regulated who could speak to the Führer, what documents were seen, what truths were told. He was a master of invisibility, manipulating rivalries from behind closed doors. The others loathed him, but Hitler relied on him with increasing dependence. In his quiet efficiency, Hitler saw something he could trust. Not emotion, not brilliance, but loyalty expressed through silence and order. What united these men was not ideology alone, but the way each adapted themselves to Hitler's needs, anticipating his desires, shielding him from contradiction. They competed not just for authority but for intimacy, for the Führer's fleeting approval. Their loyalty was never secure, and it was often performative. A compliment not returned, a delay in a response, a poorly received suggestion, any of these could invite suspicion. And under suspicion, no one was safe. As the war wore on, their relationships with Hitler evolved into tests of survival. Himmler expanded his control but grew more cautious. Goebbels doubled down on fanaticism. Göring lost himself in luxury and paranoia. Bormann tightened his grip on the inner court. They began to turn on each other, subtly at first, then with more venom. Whispers became weapons. Reports were shaped to reflect not truth, but loyalty. Each man knew that the closer one stood to Hitler, the sharper the edge of the blade. By now, the central conflict had shifted from external conquest to internal preservation. These men were no longer just builders of a regime. They were inmates in a palace of mirrors, vying to outlast each other in Hitler's ever-dimming favor. Trust had mutated into a tool, wielded not just by Hitler but by the circle itself, each trying to be indispensable, each hoping to avoid the fate of those who had fallen before. And yet, for all their differences, for all the rivalries and betrayals, one truth bound them. None of them knew how to stop. They had built a world that could not sustain peace, could not tolerate failure, and would not forgive doubt. As the walls closed in, they clung to their places, eyes fixed on the man at the center, a man whose trust had created them, and whose distrust would, in time, destroy them all. By the time the war turned irreversibly against Germany, Hitler's trust, once a tool of consolidation, had become a weapon of disintegration. The bond between the Führer and his inner circle, already taut with rivalry, began to splinter under the strain of impending collapse. As defeat loomed, each man faced a harrowing choice: maintain the illusion of loyalty or gamble on survival. The atmosphere inside the Nazi high command thickened with paranoia. Hitler no longer sought counsel but confirmation, and only the most sycophantic voices were permitted to speak. Himmler, long the high priest of ideological purity, began to sense the shifting tide. As Allied forces pressed in from the west and the Red Army advanced from the east, he reached out in secret to negotiate peace, without Hitler's knowledge or consent. It was a fatal miscalculation. When news reached Hitler, his reaction was volcanic. Himmler, who had built his career on ruthless loyalty, was branded a traitor and erased from the inner court. No explanation could redeem him. Trust once lost in Hitler's world was never recovered. Goebbels, by contrast, chose fidelity to the bitter end. Even as Berlin was reduced to rubble, he stood by Hitler, broadcasting delusions of imminent victory to a nation already broken. His fanaticism, once a tool of manipulation, became an expression of personal doom. In the final days beneath the Reich chancellery, he became Hitler's shadow, echoing his despair, mirroring his hatred. When the time came, Goebbels did not hesitate. He killed his own children, then his wife, and finally himself, performing the ultimate ritual of loyalty. It was grotesque, tragic, and in its way, deeply faithful. Meanwhile, Göring's instinct for self-preservation undid what little trust remained. Isolated in the Bavarian Alps, he interpreted Hitler's silence as incapacitation and dispatched a telegram suggesting he assume leadership. The message, however carefully worded, was taken as treason. Göring, once promised succession, was declared a usurper. His arrest was ordered, and his name was struck from Hitler's will. For a man who had built his entire identity around power and favor, the rejection was total. In Hitler's eyes, loyalty was not only an act, it was a performance that could never end. As the Nazi Empire collapsed, Martin Bormann emerged as a quiet, ghost-like presence beside Hitler. He remained until the very last days in the Führer bunker, facilitating Hitler's wishes with bureaucratic precision. He offered no grand speeches, no pleas for mercy, only paperwork and silence. When others fled or faltered, Bormann stayed, a grim functionary to a dying regime. Whether out of loyalty, fear, or opportunism, he clung to his role, vanishing into the smoke of Berlin with a body never conclusively found. His loyalty was invisible, his betrayal, if it occurred, unrecorded. But perhaps the most devastating blow to Hitler's sense of control came from within the army. On July 20th, 1944, a bomb exploded beneath a conference table at the Wolf's Lair, planted by Colonel Klaus von Stauffenberg. It failed to kill Hitler, but it succeeded in shattering the last vestiges of trust he held in the Wehrmacht. The ensuing purge was swift and brutal. Officers arrested, tortured, executed. Even those only distantly connected to the plot were not spared. In the days that followed, Hitler spoke often of betrayal, of treason festering beneath uniforms and smiles. He withdrew further, trusting only his personal bodyguards and the select few who had proven their blind devotion. What remained of his inner circle in the final weeks were men either too fanatical or too fearful to leave. They walked the dim corridors of the bunker like ghosts, whispering false hope, hiding truth. Hitler himself, once a commanding orator, had become a trembling figure of fury and delusion. Maps were pored over obsessively, units that no longer existed ordered to counterattack. Reality was no longer welcome in his presence. The circle around him knew the truth, but no one dared speak it. Their trust in him had been replaced with terror, and his trust in them had calcified into suspicion. In those final days, trust no longer mattered. The machine had devoured itself. The very mechanism Hitler had used to maintain control, divide, manipulate, reward, and punish now lay in ruins. There was no inner circle left, only remnants. Goebbels with his blind loyalty, Bormann with his silent efficiency, a scattering of adjutants, secretaries, and guards, all waiting for the inevitable. When Hitler finally chose to die, he did so on his own terms, unwilling to be paraded through the streets like Mussolini. Beside him, Eva Braun, whose role had never been political, died with quiet resolve. The others followed suit, each enacting their own performance of devotion or self-destruction. Goebbels' final act sealed the end of the myth. No empire remained, only ashes. The central conflict that had defined the regime, the balance between loyalty and ambition, trust and fear, was resolved not through reconciliation, but through annihilation. Hitler had built a world in which trust was transactional, loyalty conditional, and betrayal inevitable. In the end, he was left with exactly what he had created, a circle of men too broken to betray him and too compromised to survive him. And yet, even in destruction, the echoes of that circle endure. The men who lived in Hitler's shadow remind us not only of the cost of blind allegiance, but of how power, when built on fear and competition, cannot be sustained. The legacy they left behind is not one of triumph or tragedy, but of warning, a reminder that the more tightly one controls trust, the more violently it unravels.